Behold, I made Pontiff Sulyvahn's Profaned Greatsword from Dark Souls 3. This bad boy was 3D printed with PETG plastic on a Bamboo Labs P1S 3D printer. I reinforced it with fiberglass rods for strength and glued the pieces together using engineered joints that I designed. I used a mix of wood filler and sanding to get the surface as smooth as I could, and then hand painted it with acrylic paints in the living room of my one-bedroom apartment. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of how I made this sword specifically. And I'm also publishing a companion video at the same time that will show you how my entire workflow to make large 3D printed cosplay weapons works. This video is different from what I've ever done before, but I think it's one of the coolest things I've ever done, and I can't wait to tell you all about how I did it. Making a 7-foot sword out of plastic is no joke. Before even starting to make physical parts, I needed to prepare a high-quality model in 3D modeling software. I've used Blender since high school, and now that I'm most of the way through a mechanical engineering degree, I'm pretty proficient in engineering-focused modeling tools too. I started out with the basic mesh that I got from the Dark Souls 3 game files using modding tools. However, anyone who works in game design at all will know that the in-game models are always as simple as possible and don't have nearly as many details as are shown in-game. In order to prepare the mesh to add texture, I first subdivided it a lot. Then, I found some tileable patterns online and used a displacement modifier applied to each section of the sword as I wanted the patterns to appear. At this point, I used Bamboo Studio to repair the non-manifold edges on the model. I wasn't able to quite get the displacement as smooth as I would have liked, but I had to stop here as Blender was crashing if I tried any higher level of subdivision. To prepare the sword for 3D printing, I used a joint that I designed in engineering software. The shape has minimal thickness and is easily 3D printed in a vertical orientation, which was desirable in order to maximize the detail. By positioning these slicing parts along the entire sword, using squares to lay out the dimensions of my 3D printer's build plate, I was able to divide it up into sections. I also created 5 channels for fiberglass rods to run through in order to strengthen the sword and give it more stiffness. Many other creators use metal rods, but metal is usually banned at cosplay conventions and it adds a lot of weight, so I chose to use fiberglass. I didn't want to deal with shipping anything, so I went to Home Depot and looked at their garden stakes and driveway markers, which are often fiberglass. 5/16 inch thick rods aren't usually ideal when making something as long as this, but it was the thickest available and the width of the sword blade would make it pretty easy to run several rods through it. So I decided to get one 6-foot rod that I would run from the pommel all the way up until the end of the blade, do 2 4-foot rods that start just after the pommel, and another 2 4-foot rods that would start at the crossguard. This provides a network of reinforcement through the entire sword to avoid putting excessive load on the plastic and give it stiffness. I cut all of these shapes out of the model using the Boolean difference modifier in Blender, and then moved on to prep those parts for 3D printing. Prepping something this large for 3D printing takes more than just popping the files into the slicer and pressing go. I wanted to select a material that would be easy and safe to print in my apartment, affordable, and provide a good mix of strength and flexibility. After watching several YouTube videos online and using my prior experience with 3D printing, I decided on PETG filament. I've successfully used PLA for decently large props before, like this Sulyvahn axe, but PLA doesn't do well with flex, and some flex was inevitable with a prop this big. ABS provides excellent flexibility and impact resistance, but the styrene fumes emitted during printing are hazardous and acrid, and my apartment doesn't have a way for me to ventilate easily, so that was out of the question too. PETG offers a good balance of strength, flexibility, layer adhesion, and non-toxicity. I ended up getting some Sunlit brand PETG from Amazon for an excellent price of about $11 per roll. Designing and slicing each part took some thought and consideration too. I wanted to prioritize the wall thickness because that plays a huge role in part stiffness and strength, but I couldn't reduce the infill percentage too much for fear of the reinforcement channels tearing out and overflexing internally. In order to avoid making the sword entirely too blade heavy, I reduced the infill percentage and wall thickness proportionately as it went up the length of the blade. After doing all that, the estimated material usage was about 1.8 kilograms, or 4 pounds for the entire sword itself, with almost another pound of material to be used for supports. Now, a 4-pound greatsword in real life isn't too insane, but 4 pounds on the end of a 7-foot stick would require a lot of torque to swing around. Knowing that the weight would be concentrated somewhere between the crossguard and the middle of the blade, which is how it turned out in the end, was enough for me, especially knowing that the hilt alone is so long that I'd be able to balance it pretty well, and the fiberglass running all the way through would mean that I'd be able to actually put weight on the pommel without worrying about it breaking. In order to reduce the risk of wasting large amounts of filament in the event that an error occurred, I only printed a few pieces at a time. The total print hours came out to about 100, which is both a lot for a printer as fast as mine, at the same time incredibly fast for something this big. I knew that working with the entire sword fully assembled, it would be really awkward and difficult to apply material and to sand, so I sanded each piece and applied a mixture of wood filler and water, sanded again, and then assembled the whole sword together. I used cyanoacrylate super glue, and I've never had any problems with the Loctite brand. A lot of cosplay creators kind of hate on super glue, and listen, I understand that super glue doesn't do well with joining objects together along flat surfaces that will be parallel to the applied force. That's why I designed my joints in the way that I do. Superglue is extremely strong, but it doesn't have a lot of flexibility before it breaks. Applying the glue inside the joints makes it so that the applied stress doesn't cause nearly as much flex in the glue itself, because the glue has nowhere to go, and it's not directly subjected to the bending stress that happens when the blades turn sideways. Therefore, it doesn't break or come unstuck nearly as easily. I have broken props that I've made before, but they've always failed along the print layers themselves and not at the joints that I've made, so my track record's pretty good. I started with the 6-foot rod and glued it into the pommel, applying enough glue to provide a large contact surface, and I assembled up from there, as shown in this animation. By taking the time to engineer the joints, the Profaned Greatsword was structurally sound after about an hour of gluing, waiting, and gluing again. The pieces came together beautifully, although I will note that I didn't perfectly center the cutting shapes, so I did need to pay attention during assembly to avoid the blade pieces going together with just enough asymmetry to be ugly and annoying. I applied my wood filler mix to fill in the seams and sanded again. One of the troublesome parts with working with this project with this much detail was sanding inside all of the detailed features to get a nice smooth finish. I have to admit I didn't do a perfect job with this, as it was difficult to get into the fine lines with the sandpaper. Once fully sanded, I started to finish the sword by applying 3 coats of transparent acrylic primer. I don't have a place to use spray paint, and I'm not going to spray paint in my home, so I was left at the mercy of the paintbrush. I wish I had mixed in a gray or black with the primer in order to get a more consistent base color before continuing with the next step. I wanted to replicate the sword's in-game color, which is a pale antique gold with hints of bronze and some light. I did some consulting on the paint subreddit, and it was suggested that I try an antique gold base layer followed by a black wash and then a dry brush bronze for the highlights. I created the antique gold by mixing 1 part silver metallic paint with 2 parts of metallic gold and painting the entire sword with 3 coats. I made the black wash with a small amount of black acrylic paint and a lot of water, plus a drop of dish soap to break the surface tension a little bit better. Finally, I made bronze by mixing together equally gold, silver, and copper metallic paint, and then I dry brushed that onto the sword in the detailed spots. I think the end result looks really cool. The bronze dry brush produced a sort of patina that also evokes kind of a bloodstain look without it being overt. No matter how you cut it, I think this sword is absolutely awesome. I'm incredibly happy with how it turned out despite some small flaws and imperfections, and my friend who commissioned it was incredibly happy with the result too. As you can see in this video, it's possible to pose and carry it without too much difficulty. There is some blade flex, which is to be expected, and it occurs in real swords too. I definitely wouldn't swing this sword as if it was real, but I do feel perfectly confident carrying it around and posing with it. Some angles can be a little bit difficult to hold for a long time, but it's not too difficult to hold, generally speaking, and it looks pretty awesome. I can't wait to make something like this again. So leave a comment to provide me with suggestions and subscribe for more content like this. And be sure to check out my new video explaining how to prepare your own models for 3D printing to make big cosplay props like this using my joint designs, and share this video with your friends. You guys are the best, and I wish you the world for your time and attention. Until next time.